This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Over the weekend, we did a video on the UK's ongoing gilt crisis, characterised by the relatively steep uptick in borrowing costs that the UK has suffered over the past month or so. In the comments, we got a whole load of people telling us that the real culprits here are the Bank of England, the UK's nominally independent central bank. So in this video, we're going to explain why at least some people think that the Bank of England is to blame for the recent turmoil in gilt markets, whether they actually are, and how, whatever the answer to that question, this whole episode has put the notion of central bank independence under strain. If you want more UK political drama from us, then check out our podcast Starmageddon, where we track the successes and failures of this new Labour government. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So, let's start with a super quick recap of what's happened over the past month or so. In short, the UK's borrowing costs have risen relatively sharply, having risen quite steadily over the past year or so. And long-term borrowing costs are now at their highest level since 2008. This is part of a wider increase in bond markets across the world, but the UK has been particularly badly affected. In our past video, we suggested that this was mainly due to the UK's particularly dire fiscal outlook, as evidenced by the conspicuously weak GDP and jobs data recently, and the concurrent collapse of the pound. However, it's at least possible that this situation has been exacerbated by the Bank of England, which is currently engaged in what's known as quantitative tightening. And to understand this process, we need to go back in time a bit. Basically, since the financial crisis in 2008, the bank has been engaged in quantitative easing. In other words, buying up government bonds to keep borrowing costs low and facilitate government spending. They've been doing this pretty constantly since 2008, but things really kick into gear during emergencies like the pandemic, when the private markets aren't functioning, so there's no new demand for government debt, even though the government needs to spend more money. All in all, the bank bought up something like £800 billion worth of government debt during this period. And this was pretty great news for the Treasury. Not only did it basically get an £800 billion loan to keep things running over the past few years, but the fact that the Bank of England was happy to buy up government debt reassured investors and kept borrowing costs low. However, in 2022, the Bank of England decided to start reversing this process and began selling bonds on its balance sheet back to the private market in a process known as quantitative tightening, or QT. Now, this was bad news for the Treasury for two reasons. Firstly, more bonds on the private market meant higher borrowing costs, because unless demand for bonds increases, more supply means lower bond prices, which de facto means higher interest rates. But second, because the bank bought these bonds when prices were high and interest rates were low, and now is selling them when bond prices are lower but interest rates are higher, it essentially makes a loss on these sales. Now, this isn't bad news for the Bank of England. After all, it doesn't matter if the bank makes a loss because it can't go bankrupt. It's a central bank. However, for complicated and controversial reasons, the Treasury has to reimburse the bank for any losses it makes. And because the bank was selling hundreds of billions of bonds a year, these losses were pretty massive, costing the Treasury about £38 billion in 2023 and £40 billion in 2024. For context, that fiscal black hole that Labour got so het up about last year was just $20 billion, and their fiscal headroom, that is, the difference between the current spending plans and the ceiling implied by the fiscal rules, is just over $9 billion. The point we're making is that in this context, £40 billion is a lot of money. Anyway, quantitative tightening began in September 2022 and was soon followed by the mini-budget disaster, which is why Liz Truss has spent the past 2 years blaming the bank for the market meltdown. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why on earth is the Bank of England doing this? After all, it feels a little bit like the bank is imposing fiscal hardship on the UK for no real good reason, given that it can't go bankrupt, and things seem to be going all right, if not better, when the bank was doing quantitative easing instead. And, well, the answer is kind of complicated. It's in part because the bank has decided that the UK is now out of the pandemic and free from emergency, so doesn't need support from its central bank. The Bank of England also claims that they're creating space for more quantitative easing in the future. Although we're not really sure that makes sense, given that Well, there's no limit on the bank's quantitative easing purchases, and that quantitative tightening isn't really affecting the economy. Although, well, that's definitely debatable given that A, what happened to trusts, and B, the steep increase in bond prices recently. But the main reason seems to be that the bank just thinks this is the best way of them demonstrating their independence. For context, since 1997, the Bank of England has been operationally independent, which means that, in trying to do its job of maintaining financial stability while keeping inflation around 2% year on year, it makes its own decisions without input from the Treasury, which is how things used to work. The basic rationale for this is that governments will, in theory, have an inflationary bias. In other words, if they were to be in charge of monetary policy, democratically elected politicians would tend to spend too much money and keep interest rates too low, which would lead to dangerous levels of inflation. Independent central banks are supposed to avoid this pitfall. By being operationally independent, they can raise interest rates and tamp down inflation even if it's politically unpopular. Now, this can actually be good for governments, because when markets believe that your central bank is independent, they generally offer you lower borrowing rates. Anyway, the Bank of England wants to reverse quantitative easing and get back to normal in order to prove that it's not just printing money to help politicians. In a sense, by continuing with quantitative tightening, despite the pressure it's currently putting on government finances, the bank is re-emphasizing its independence, proving that it's not affected by political/fiscal considerations. But well, this is a contentious definition for independence. For starters, it's worth noting that other central banks, like the ECB and the Federal Reserve, aren't as enthusiastic about quantitative tightening as the Bank of England is. But on top of that, the Bank of England's main job is guaranteeing stability. Is it really doing that if it's pushing the UK into another round of austerity and possibly recession? Ultimately, there's no easy way to answer this question, and it all depends on how you define or interpret the bank's nominal independence. But whatever side of that argument you end up on, what this episode has conclusively demonstrated is that while central bank independence was a relatively uncontested idea back in the 2000s and even the 2010s, when central banks were doing nice things like cutting interest rates and buying up government debt, it will become an increasingly contested idea as they start doing nasty things, like raising interest rates and selling that debt back. There's a lot of difficult decisions necessary here, and making huge decisions, especially quickly, is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes can help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive data sets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. Now, that might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you'll learn this by answering questions like, which airline is most likely to have a delay due to weather? And how much more unruly have airline passengers gotten since the pandemic? Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating our modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. So try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR, or by clicking the link in the description. And by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.